All right, let's get this show on the road. I'd like to thank everybody for joining our virtual marathon here for the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. We're in mile 7. I'd like to welcome aboard Joanne Klein. She's going to talk about protecting your team's work across Office 365. So Joanne, take it away.
All right, I just want to do a quick sound check. Give me a thumbs up if the sound is coming through loud and clear. Awesome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session. A pleasure for you to be here, and I'm pretty excited about this session. As you can see in the bottom right corner, this session is sponsored by AvePoint, so I just want to give them a shout out. Thank you for that. There we go. All right, so just everybody mark your calendars for next year. The Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference will be in March. Hopefully in person in Vegas. And as well, want to thank the sponsors for the virtual marathon event. Without them, this certainly would not be possible. So thank you to them. A little bit about myself. My name is Joanne Klein, and I hail from Saskatchewan, which is in Western Canada, and I own my own consulting company, spending most of my time working with customers in Microsoft 365 on the data governance aspect. So data retention, data protection, e-discovery, classification, those kinds of things. So because of that, this presentation is something that I work with quite closely with customers. So I'm going to share some things I've learned with you today. Today's agenda is covering this on a few key pillars. One is to talk about the root concern for protecting your data and something Microsoft calls the shared responsibility model and why that works so well when you're trying to implement some of these controls across Microsoft 365. Then, of course, protecting that sensitive information, retaining some of that teamwork, and then collaborating with external parties securely. And then some takeaways and a summary at the end. I'll talk about licensing a little bit at the end as well. By and large, today I will mostly be focused on what's highlighted there and give you kind of how it works across Microsoft 365. Just want to set the ground a little bit before I start. Something shared by Microsoft, and that was 88% of organizations do not have confidence in detecting and then preventing the loss of any sensitive data they may have across their tenant. More than 80% of corporate data is considered dark, which means it's not classified, it's not protected nor governed. That's all your unstructured content that end users are creating every day, lots of it. We need to figure out how we're going to protect that data. And the number one concern is protecting and governing sensitive data for regulatory means. Now, the impact of COVID-19 and working from home has kind of put an interesting spin on this. Now more than ever, there's more people working from home. So 300 million global office workers are working from home right now. 40% of CXOs indicate that information security is a primary risk from this COVID-19 pandemic. However, they're also concerned, of course, about employee health and safety. So it's a balanced concern, but it's a concern nonetheless. And one we can do something about, and what I'm going to address is kind of that 40% in the corner there. So to talk about this, I want to emphasize the idea that not all teams are created equal. And by that, I mean you can't apply the same kind of broad brush of protection across absolutely everything. There's different content in different places. So if we look at the traditional kind of hierarchy, I usually explain collaboration and SharePoint sites and collaboration spaces. There's kind of the authoritative area, kind of the company-wide area. Then the a little bit lower down department and division, you might have a couple of people kind of curating content there with a very large audience. And then, of course, all of the Microsoft Teams and, lower workspaces that teams are using. So very different workspaces, but content can be in all of them. And as a matter of fact, not all, but some of your sensitive content can be strewn all across all of those 3 types of sites. So what I would, sorry about that. So because of this, you really need to be able to apply that protection at scale across your environment. The shared responsibility model is a couple of different partnerships. The first one is what your organization has with Microsoft. Microsoft is constantly getting updates from regulatory bodies for the services in the back end, and you as an organization have to, in some cases, comply with these changes that are coming in. So Microsoft is their shared responsibility model means you as an organization are responsible for the data, the identities, and the devices in your organization, while Microsoft vigorously protects the Microsoft 365 service. Okay, so that's a partnership you have in order to do that. But you also have a partnership within your own organization with several different teams to get your own digital house in order. And this is every organization's responsibility to do this. There's 3 key groups. First and foremost is the largest group, and that would be the business information workers. They're the ones that are adding the content all the time. Now, I want to specifically call out this group because in this work from home scenario we're all in, many information workers are kind of going through what I'm calling a digital mind shift. They're having to learn some new skills. First of all, it's in their best interest to learn how to effectively use all of the modern collaboration tools to their benefit. They must know how to collaborate securely across all of their networks. They should be cybersecurity aware. If you can remember back to the concern that CXOs have of people working from home during COVID-19, this is top of mind for many of them. As well, it's a shift from being in an in-person mode to an online mode. So things are done a little bit differently. Now, one call out I want to do is something Microsoft announced a couple of weeks ago, specifically targeting this. Due to the overwhelming concerns that organizations have for all of their workforce working from home, Microsoft has partnered with TerraNova Security, I believe is the name of the company, for some free training on phishing and privacy education. I went through a couple of these really good videos, great for your end users across your organization, mass phishing, protecting your home computer, and privacy. So I would highly recommend that, free. All right, so let's move on to IT teams. So of course, these are the teams. I expect many of you are listening right now for toggling all the switches in the back end, but you're really part of a larger team to work with in your organization. And last but certainly not least are the legal, risk, and compliance teams. All of those teams that are very aware of what your regulatory obligations and controls need to be to secure and protect your data. So those legal, risk, and compliance teams really understands an organization's duty to preserve data well past its business value. And that may be for several reasons. It could be for legal obligations, regulatory obligations, or even contractual obligations, depending on the type of industry you're in and kind of what vector you're looking at this from. So to address this, I like to look through this through a lens of governance, and there's many kinds of governance, to be clear. So that's kind of a general term. So I've broken it apart into these types of governance, and what is related to our conversation today is container and content governance, and then security governance. So to demonstrate this, we're going to walk through 3 different personas and how they might implement some of these controls in the environment. Now, these are maybe extreme personas I'm going to demonstrate, and it may not land with you in your specific organization, but it gives you a flavor for the way you can look at some of these controls, and there's many ways to slice and dice these and configure them to suit your own organization. So John this is a traditional company. He works in the IT department of a bank, and they usually use quite restrictive settings. Kate works in IT at Contoso, but they like to find the best balance between user freedom and IT control. And Chad works in the IT department of Tailspin Toys. They want to drive productivity by removing as many barriers as possible. So quite a span there. So let's pick a typical scenario. Let's talk about self-service site creation. So John in the bank might want to really control that site provisioning process with a strict approval mechanism in place, have automation to control external access, naming conventions, protection. They've gone the whole gamut. They really want to lock that down. Kate, they want to leverage consistent site designs, which is a way to auto provision sites if you want, but they allow them to provision without approval, and then they follow up after the fact for additional guidance and controls, a perfectly acceptable model. Chad, they use out-of-the-box provisioning features entirely. Their stance is end users know what they want and they don't want to get in their way. Okay, so if we go back to container and content governance, within that would be protecting your teamwork. And in this session, we're focused in on sensitive teamwork, right? Because that's really what we're concerned about, not absolutely everything. And then how do you retain your teamwork? So if we look at container and content governance, it really includes a lot of things. Everything from empowering your employees, where we talk about self-service site creation, do end users know how to externally share securely and safely, to identifying the content that you consider valuable in your own tenant, some controls there. Once you've identified them, how do you protect them? And then there's always an accountability piece on reviewing ownership of those sites, reviewing external membership, all kinds of things there. So it covers quite a range of things. I'm going to focus on probably 4 or 5 of these items under here to address this. This is a very large topic, so honing it down to 50 minutes is quite challenging. So a good place to start. Really, we want to make sure when we're protecting our teamwork that we're protecting it wherever it lives. That's the whole idea behind this. We're not focused in on one site. We're focused in on everywhere that end users can store their content. If you remember back to that triangle diagram, there can be sensitive content in many, many places, and you need to understand where that is and then protect it. First thing to do is to define a classification scheme for your organization, and that's a way of classifying what you consider sensitive or highly sensitive and what you don't. Then having a really good understanding of where your sensitive data lives in your tenant and what users are doing with it to really hone in on what may be at risk. And then sensitivity labels. This is the hallmark, I believe, of protection across Microsoft 365, part of the larger Microsoft Information Protection solution. Really important. I'm going to show a lot of that today. And then data loss prevention. Data loss prevention has been around for a while. There's some new investments coming into this, but this is another way, an additional way of governing your sensitive data. So defining your classification scheme. What I have here, last I've heard anyway, unless they've changed it, is actually Microsoft's classification. And the only reason I have this up here is to demonstrate a point, and that is how simplicity is brilliant. You do not want to get this so complicated that information workers really don't know how or what to label a piece of content. So that's kind of the first thing I want to highlight. The second thing is the top 2 confidentiality settings there, confidential and highly confidential, are very clear. I have seen some classification systems that use top secret and confidential, not clear enough because an end user maybe wouldn't know easily or quickly how to differentiate the two. So between highly confidential and confidential, you clearly know which one is more sensitive in nature. So come up with your own system and vet it with end users, try it out and see if it's as clear as you think it is. Next is understanding your data. You really need to know where sensitive data is across your organization to build out your policies. You will see this in the data classification feature in the Compliance Center. You can find out more about this by the link on the top right. When you go in here, you will see content across your environment. Now, what I'm showing you now is from my own business tenant. So I have sensitivity labels in use. I also have retention labels in use. So that's why you're seeing content already coming in there. As you can see, it shows not only the usage of each of those types of labels, but also the workloads that they're used against on the bottom. In preview is trainable classifiers, where you can define a classifier. I'll talk more about that later. And you can classify your data based on that, and sensitive information types as well. So many built-in sensitive information types, you can also build your own and then subsequently classify your data based on that. The biggest, most impactful part for me for data classification is the Content Explorer. Given the right roles and permissions, you can have insight into what's going on across your tenant. As you can see there on the left-hand side, all of the sensitive information types and the number of occurrences it's detected across Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive are shown. So if you clicked into SharePoint, you could drill right down to the specific document that had that sensitive information type. Really a powerful tool. So this is something that your compliance teams will want to use for gaining that oversight on the tool. A lot of permission. This is you gain insight into absolutely everything that's going on across the environment. So this would be kind of an administration governance type activity. Same for sensitivity labels. In this tenant, there's 5 sensitivity labels and they're strewn across those 3 workloads. Same with retention labels. You can see it all in this Explorer. If you turn on data visualization, it's a good way for a visual of what we just saw. You get a really quick overview on what most of your data is across your tenant, across all these 3 types again, and retention labels. So I love this feature, and you can click into each one of those tiles there again to drill down right to the specific document if you want. And last but not least is Activity Explorer. So this really shows the activity for sensitivity labels and retention labels and what is going on across your environment. As you can see, there's lots of activities that are logged, audited and logged and tracked on here. But this would be something that you'd want to maybe dig into if you want to adjust some of your policies. So this is a great tool for learning about your environment, building your policies, and then subsequently modifying them and updating them. Okay, let's move on to sensitivity labels. So these do many things. They do content markings like watermark, header, footer. They can apply encryption, which means who can access it and what can they do with it. There's the rights you can apply based on that sensitivity label. So there's all kinds of things you can restrict or allow based on a sensitivity label. As well, some of the new capabilities coming in this is you can auto apply and recommend a sensitive sensitivity label based on a sensitive information type, which is really powerful. And that's on the client side. Soon coming is being able to do that based on a trainable classifier as well. On the service side, there's a preview program that will detect content at scale across SharePoint and OneDrive, all of your content at rest, and be able to apply a sensitivity label there as well. And it does exchange online emails in transit. So this is a way of at scale applying sensitivity labels to all the content across your tenant. So I'm really happy to see these capabilities coming. So the end user experience with sensitivity labels I threw all of these GIFs together and I'm going to sit on the screen for a little bit so you can see it's a little bit different depending on what platform you're on. But at the end of the day, they're all bringing in the same classifications in the form of sensitivity labels that you've configured in your environment. All right, so 2 new features that are introduced to get rid of this annoying problem. If you've used sensitivity labels in the past that's implied encryption, you probably would have got this message when you went to open up this document in Word Online, let's say. So now that no longer happens. You can view encrypted files right within Office Online, which allows for co-authoring, which means it's discoverable, any discovery and search. So it really opens up that collaboration aspect on files protected by an encrypted sensitivity label. Public preview, I just talked about that a couple slides ago. This is where auto labeling your files at rest in SharePoint and OneDrive. This is really a fantastic feature. Now you can turn this on in kind of simulation mode, so you can see if we were to configure this and turn this on and enable it in our tenant, what kind of content would be labeled. Because as you can imagine, you want to get this right. You want to make sure you're not labeling things incorrectly. So there is a simulation mode to this, which is pretty helpful. So I highly recommend this as well. And once you start applying sensitivity labels, you're going to see this show up in SharePoint lists and libraries. It's just going to be another column you can bring into your library if you want. And this is just a sample of a library I have in my own tenant. All right, another really cool thing you can do with the classifications you have set up and your sensitivity labels is site and group settings. Now this applies to teams, sites, and groups, and all of the locations that you can actually provision a team, site, or group. So you can set per label the privacy. So will this be private or will it be a public site? Will you allow external user access? And what about if an unmanaged device tries to browse to this site? What will happen then? So you can control all this at the sensitivity label setting for when you apply it to a team, site, or group. In public preview now, a really excellent capability. So this is what it looks like. If I have a board of directors site, I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center, and I change the sensitivity to, in this case, highly confidential. So these are the same sensitivity label settings that are defined as for documents right now. Okay, so if we browse to that site, you're going to see highly confidential, of course, right up there by the site title. If you click that, I have a usage guidelines URL parameter set up with this. I believe that's only done through PowerShell. I would highly recommend you do this and wire this up to some kind of a governance page where you explain what all of these confidentiality names mean to an end user, so they know how to properly handle their content in that site. Really important and quite a simple thing to do. So let's walk through some of those other settings you could set on a sensitivity label. If we had a top secret label, and these are the settings we gave, so it needs to be private. We don't want to allow external access, and we want to allow limited web-only access on an unmanaged device. So if we had a site set up with this, you can see as soon as I pick the top secret sensitivity, the privacy settings are grayed out. It's automatically private. I cannot change that to public even if I wanted to. And you're going to see the sensitivity up at the underneath the site title, as well as the fact that it's a private group. If you try to add an external user as a member, you're going to be stopped from doing that. And of course, if you try to access the site from an unmanaged device, that's the message you're going to get. So it adds all of these controls in place. Another thing that happens is if you try to upload a document that is of higher sensitivity than what you've given the site, you will get a warning in the form of an email. All of these activities are audited, so it won't stop the upload from happening, but it will notify you, hey, you've just put, in this case, a super secret document in a general site. Is this okay? Did you mean to do this? And it gives you some actions you can take. So just informing the end user of what they've done so they can make a conscious decision on either moving it, or maybe the JoJo's project site in this example needs to be more sensitive than just general. Okay, I want to talk a little bit, if you're still on the AIP, Azure Information Protection labels, you will want to be moving off of them onto these unified sensitivity labels by March 31st of next year, because they are being deprecated. So there's just some links I've got on here for migrating, and there's some client differences that are going to change the end user experience, so just make sure you're familiar with what those are. Okay, I want to move on to data loss prevention. So this detects when a user action conflicts with a DLP policy you may have in place, and you might see these warnings on files if it detects sensitive content in there. So they can do a bunch of things. They can use sensitive information types and retention labels, cannot currently use sensitivity labels, but that is coming. So that's going to be one way of kind of wiring those two together. You can also use data loss prevention for Microsoft Teams chat and channel conversations. So it detects when there's guest access or external access, and can prevent, block or warn when you're sharing some sensitive information with them. So here's the experience if you're in the Outlook client, and in this case I've got a DLP policy set up to detect when a customer number is in use. So in this case, customer BB44444. So in this tenant, I have a custom sensitive information type set up for a customer. And I get a policy tip telling me what I can do about that. This one looks like it's blocking, or I can override if I want. And that's the prompt that comes up. So it does tell you what you've done wrong and gives you a way to resolve it. So this is up to how you want to configure the DLP policy, of course, on how that works. In Microsoft Teams, if I'm having a chat with someone external to my tenant, and in this case, I'm sending them a social insurance number, which this tenant considers sensitive, it does block it, gives me a link to override it. If I click the what can I do link, and I can put in a reason. So the external recipient just sees that. They don't actually see the message. And in my experience, this has been quite quick for that DLP policy to fire, as in seconds. All right, I want to talk about a little bit about the DLP roadmap. This is a little dated from a few months back, but I want to hone in on this one setting that is now available. And I would recommend, if you're using sensitivity labels and DLP to take action in your environment, to enable this. And that is the sensitive by default setting. How the DLP mechanism works is it is not instantaneous. It works kind of on a crawling mechanism, and it needs to scan the content before it identifies it as sensitive or not. So if you don't have this enabled, your content, if it has sensitive data in it, may be exposed. It could be shared before a DLP recognizes it's sensitive to somebody external, let's say. If you enable this setting, it will assume it's sensitive and therefore will block it from an external user. But as soon as it scans it and determines it's sensitive or not, then it will let it go. So a really good setting to use. So let's talk about striking a perfect balance, and the fact that this is actually not perfect, but it's pretty good, and you're constantly kind of balancing one side with the other. On one side, you want to secure and protect your data. I don't think anyone would argue with that. There's a bunch of controls. We've talked about some of them already, mostly on the data side. Remember, there's identity and devices that are part of this as well, that shared responsibility model. Right now, I'm talking about the data. The flip side of that is you don't want to impede productivity in your environment. And sometimes you have to make compromises in how you configure some of these things and the settings that you have. So just to call this out, when you're working with your compliance teams and the security teams, sometimes you have to come to alignment on what is manageable and what is, I guess, realistic for your own organization. So let's go back to our scenario-based story on what we just covered. So if we wanted to protect our sensitive content, John at the bank, they auto-classify sensitivity labels to their content at rest in SharePoint and OneDrive and in Office apps, and they require users to provide a reason for override if necessary. They use data loss prevention across all their locations and block access to SharePoint sites from all unmanaged devices. At Contoso, they allow users to collaborate freely with external users. However, they're monitoring using that data classification tool I just showed you when sensitive information is being shared before turning on their DLP policies and auto labeling policies. So they really want to get a handle on what's out there, how's it being used, where is it stored, how are we going to protect this? And then they allow web-only access to their confidential SharePoint sites. Chad wants to, they apply a default sensitivity label to all content, which you can do, by the way, and they rely on their end users to adjust it as necessary. They allow external sharing on all sites by default and full access to SharePoint sites, even from unmanaged devices. So one extreme to the other, odds are you are somewhere in the middle of those three, but just to demonstrate kind of the different approach you can take. So let's move on to retention for a bit. So retention can do three things, basically. It can just do a retain only, so it makes sure you have something retained for a period of time. It can retain and then delete, so it will retain it for however you want and then make sure it's deleted after that. Or maybe not obvious, but it can, a retention policy or a retention label can be set up to just delete. So it makes sure nothing is there past whatever time period you come up to. This is called built-in compliance, and by that they mean the content lives in the tenant. You're not moving it outside into another repository. You're retaining it right within the same environment, sometimes in the same library. There's lots of options on that. I talked about that in my session yesterday. But if you can keep it within your tenant, there's many advantages to that. If it's there, you can detect it and protect it and secure it. eDiscovery can find it, data subject requests can find it, search can find it. Lots of benefits to keeping it within Microsoft 365. Just going to stay on the screen for a little bit. There's slight difference between retention policy and retention label as far as what you can apply to what workload. So just be aware of that. And then I want to talk about how you can actually apply retention across your teamwork. So you can certainly apply it manually, but that is not a particularly scalable approach. You can apply it in an automated fashion, and there's a bunch of ways to do that. I'm going to show on the next slide. And then announced fairly recently, using those trainable classifiers I've referred to earlier, you can also use those classifiers to apply retention labels as well. So this is more the scale than what we had last time. Odds are you're probably not manually applying retention labels to a lot of content percentage-wise across your environment. You might be auto-applying, kind of depending on your licensing and the configuration you have set up. But a large part of your data, it would be awesome if you could leverage machine learning to help apply retention at scale. So to automatically apply a retention label, there's a bunch of ways, 8 ways. Not going to go through these. I have my other session talked about them a little bit, and I have blogged extensively about that. So check that out at joanneklein.com. A new way is through the trainable classifier. So this is in preview mode now, but really take a look at this if you have the right licensing to be able to apply retention at scale. So the idea behind trainable classifiers is to identify content across your environment without somebody having to explicitly go and tag it and identify it. Microsoft has provides 5 built-in classifiers, but so to be clear, classifiers are used for more than just retention. They're used for other features as well, communication compliance, sensitivity. So none of these really are applicable to retention, I would say, but you can build your own, which is where the power comes in. So if you imagine the type of content you might have across your environment where sensitivity and retention do have a part to play, I would suggest that you would build a classifier for those types of contents. And those examples I have up on the screen there are examples I can think of that most organizations would have and would want to apply retention to. And you will see that now when you go to automatically apply a retention label as an option. Microsoft has removed offensive language. That's why I've got that striked out, but it's still in the UI. So you would see a custom, there's the built-in ones, you would see your custom one in here if you were to build it as well. On the sensitivity label side, if you choose to do auto labeling in your Office apps or your client, you will also see classifiers as an option if you want, in addition to sensitive information types. So all of these features kind of interrelate with each other in public preview right now. So let's go back to retaining for our 3 scenarios. So John at the bank, they have retention labels published aligning to likely a fairly complex file plan. And that retains the regulated content, and they have disposition review turned on, which means they review some of their records before they're allowed to be deleted. They have retention policies on Teams chat to delete after 5 days. So they would consider Teams chat kind of a liability in their organization. 8, they have retention policies published across their collaboration locations. This is transparent to their end users, but it still allows it to be discoverable. And they delete Teams chat after 1 month. Chad, they have a few retention labels defined for their most valuable content, and they use auto apply capabilities so end users don't have to remember to do it. And they do not delete Teams chat. Very different takes on content within your environment and even something like the Teams chat. I had put out a Twitter poll earlier this week on what organizations are doing with their Teams chat, and I got 115 or so responses. And of those 115, 32% did have a retention policy published for their Teams chats, anywhere from 1 day up, and the rest didn't. So it's interesting to hear, to see how different organizations, probably depending on their industry, on how regulated they are, kind of take a look at Teams chats. Okay, let's talk about security governance. So this would be, how do you collaborate with your external users in a secure way? So there's external access. So you can configure this in your Teams admin center. So you can, any external access users, they don't have any specific access to Teams or Teams resources. You can use them to connect, find, call, chat, and set up meetings with you. That would be considered an external access user. So you can enable or disallow, allow or disallow these users by domain. And on the more kind of granular side would be what's called guest access. And these are the external users that have access to your Teams chat or your teams and channels in Microsoft Teams. So you can invite them in, let's say on a project team, if you were working with an external user for a specific project, okay? So anyone not part of your organization can be added as a guest. So as you can imagine, any kind of external access is a risk for an organization on what's being shared with them. What are you collaborating on? What are you discussing? Which is where a lot of these controls are born from. So to collaborate with them securely on the external access side, define the domains that you want to allow in there. Use those allow and deny lists. If you have some partner domains you want to be able to collaborate with. Coming soon is automatic expiration of external user access, which is a good one. On the guest access, it can be set at a Teams org-wide level or a team or a group level, and you can control who can allow guests. Available now is you can disable guest access at a team site level based on sensitivity of the team site. If you remember the previous demo I had, when you set a sensitivity label, you can define what that external user access setting will be for a particular team site or group. So definitely leverage that. Just some things to think about on the external sharing side. Now that setting does not affect external sharing, okay? That is coming, it's top of mind for Microsoft, but it's not there right now. So many organizations enable external sharing by default, but disable it based on classification. That seems like a good place to be. If it's a confidential site, just you don't allow that, let's say. Limit domains is required. Make sure you educate your end users on how to share a document. Are you going to allow editing? Are you going to expire that share after a certain period of time? Make sure they understand all those settings and are using them effectively. Make sure you use the sensitive by default DLP setting for SharePoint and OneDrive documents, and the audit side. So really you need to make security audits part of your governance process. And there's many controls in Office 365 where that is a significant part. So have, a couple of people assigned for kind of different areas to follow up and see what's going on behind the scenes to really monitor end user actions. All right, so for John, guest access and external access, they need to be very selective on who they collaborate with. So they have definitely used their allow lists for external access to limit collaboration to specific domains. Kate, they allow users to collaborate with, allow their users to collaborate with externals. However, they're currently preventing guest users while they establish their organization collaboration culture in teams and define their classification scheme. So this is something that when you're defining your classification scheme, it's one of the controls you have to know how you're going to associate it with any one of the classifications. It's one of the factors. And Chad, they allow communication with any external parties. They do not want to impede their users' ability to do more. So in summary, takeaways from today. First and foremost, define your classification scheme. Keep it meaningful. Don't make it so complicated that end users can't understand it. I think simple is better. Have an external user strategy. Know what your controls you're going to have in place for all of your sensitivity labels and how that affects your collaboration experience with external users. Then build all of the policies. So this covers a wide range of features in Microsoft 365, but a lot of them kind of lean on or built on top of you having that classification scheme in place to begin with. Sensitivity, retention, privacy, guest access, conditional access, and educate your users. That is really important so they understand how to work securely in a modern workplace. Okay, I wanted to share a licensing slide because I get asked this quite a bit about the features I talked about today. Many of them available, or some of them available only with an advanced compliance add-on, as well as some of the features I talked about. On the left-hand side is what is either coming soon or here. If you haven't participated in any of these previews, get in. It's really it's a good opportunity for IT people to try them out and see what they're like and how they work. On the right-hand side is Microsoft's top of mind external sharing based on sensitivity. So when you set that external user access at the sensitivity label settings, that is not translating into external sharing capability. They're also thinking about separation of sensitivity labels from documents and emails versus site teams and groups. So one thing I didn't say is if you apply a sensitivity label to a site, let's say of highly confidential, that does not mean that every document you upload to that site will also be highly confidential. That does not happen. Sorry, that's the next point is the inheritance. That link I have, if you download my slides, is a survey from Microsoft on if you would like that inheritance to happen. How do you see that looking? They really want to get some input on how to build that feature. So if that's something you think you want, make sure you provide input on that survey. I want to go back to the second point. Right now, if you define the sensitivity labels in the Compliance Center, that applies to not only documents and emails, but also to site teams and groups. Microsoft is thinking about separating them out a little bit so you can have some of them apply to documents and emails and some apply to site teams and groups. So I don't know what that would look like, but I just, they have shared this recently, so I just wanted to share it with you as well. All right, that's the end of the presentation. I just wanted to show this again in case you haven't seen it. It's a great opportunity for you to win an Oculus Quest. So submit your answers and enter the raffle. And as well, please donate to some of these causes endorsed by the organizing committee to help out with people that are in need right now. All right, so I'm going to leave this slide up. Please provide feedback for not only me, but also the event. We'd love to hear that. And I've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm opening it up to some questions. So I think Michael is monitoring the Q&A for me, so we'll see if we've got any.
Right now the queue's empty, but we can give it a
couple minutes. I can't believe there's no questions.
I know, right? We had 28-ish people here.
Okay.
Don't be shy, folks.
Looks like we got a question, Mike, from Julian.
Oops, published it. Concerning licensing, I see a retention labels auto apply requires O365 E5 license, but for who? Is it for the one who configured the policy or the one who created the document?
The way that works is the license is required if anybody, how can I word this? Anybody who has edit rights to the document requires the license. So that could be a lot of people. Actually, I'm just going to follow up on that if there's no other questions. I want to also point out, particularly on the retention side and licensing, is many of the auto apply capabilities require advanced compliance or an E5 license or an advanced SKU in order to do that. That also includes if you default a document library to have a retention label or default a folder to have a retention label. Even though it's a default, it's still considered an auto apply capability, and it does require an advanced license SKU. So just wanted to make that clarification. I received that question a lot, so I just thought I would share. All right, well, we're 1 minute left. No more questions?
Everybody saying thanks.
Okay. Thanks for coming, everybody. Much appreciated.
Great stuff, Joanne. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.